Today I'm going to show you how I decorated this stitch cake. Come join me. I started off with preparing to make my stitch out of fondant. So I had a picture of stitch and I used a piece of parchment paper over top of my fondant, and then I had my picture of stitch. And so I kind of used some fondant tools and traced it over top of the piece of parchment paper onto my rolled out piece of fondant. After tracing over top of it, I used a knife and then traced over top of that, cutting out my outline of stitch. After I had him all cut out, I went back over that same picture and I started to make the details. So I used each one of the colors that were necessary for the picture, and I traced out the individual components of his face with those colors, doing the same technique, tracing over top and then cutting out the individual pieces. So here I was pulling out the color of eyes as well as the color of his chest and chin. Here I am making his arms. And again, going back and forth using that same picture, tracing over top of the pieces of fondant with a piece of parchment paper in between, and then cutting out those pieces. This is his other arm. And then I'm forming his little fingers too. There I was making his eyes. And his pupils, and his nose. Here I'm cutting out his mouth. Then I'm going to use some piping gel and put all those pieces down onto that original outline of stitch. And there's where I'm using that piping gel and putting each one of the pieces down securely. Here I am kind of forming his feet, and I'm going to be using some navy blue to make the pads of his feet and his little toes. And I'm just placing each one of those onto his feet. Now I'm going to go in and I'm going to make the pink part of his ears. So I'm rolling that out and doing that same technique where I'm tracing and then cutting out the individual pieces. And then I'm going to use some piping gel and I'm going to secure them onto his ears. You can see his personality starting to come through. Here I am making his teeth out of white fondant in little triangles. While you can't fully see it on this screen, I am definitely adding his teeth using some piping gel. Now I'm making an ice cream cone that he's going to be holding, so I'm using my bench scraper and I'm just kind of making those lines that are on an ice cream cone shell. And of course I have to make the ice cream as well, so that's the next step. Here I am making the ice cream. And I'm going to include a cherry on top of that, so I just added that. So now I'm adding that onto the stitch. Now I'm moving on to some of the other components. This is a surfboard that's going to be on the side of the cake. So now I'm going to make some flowers to decorate this surfboard. And I'm going to put those on to the surfboard using piping gel. So I'm putting them kind of hanging off the side of the surfboard, as you would see on a real surfboard. So they're going to be all over the surfboard. And after I have them all over it, I'm going to cut off the excess that's along the sides. Now I'm going to go back and put his arms onto our stitch so you can see him holding on to that ice cream cone. Now I'm making the letters for the person's name that this cake is for. Just using different colors because this is a very colorful cake. And for this, I'm going to be putting these letters onto this yellow sign that I'm going to put onto the top of the cake. Now that I have the letters secured on, I'm going to square up this piece of fondant. And then I'm going to put skewers into the bottom of it because that's what I'll use to put them onto the cake. Now I'm moving on to the number 3 because this cake is for a 3-year-old little girl. So I'm cutting out my 3 in purple fondant. And this is going to go onto a piece of teal fondant. So I'm cutting this out, and then I'm going to make my square pieces of teal fondant. So I don't want to be able to see the skewers, so I'm making 2 pieces of this teal fondant squares, and I'm going to put the skewers in between them and then glue this number 3 onto the top using piping gel, which you'll see here in a second. As I mentioned, here I'm using piping gel. I'm going to add those skewers. I'm going to put that second piece of fondant. And then I'm going to add my number 3 onto this little topper that I'll put on top of the cake. So I'm moving on to making some flowers for on this cake. So I'm using a circle cutout to make these flowers. Making a bunch of different colors. Got some orange, blue, teal, some pink, and then I'm cutting some little triangles out of each one of these throughout to make the individual petals. And after I do that for all of them, I'm going to use my little rolling pin and I'm going to make these flatter, which will make them more realistic looking so they don't look so cut out, if you will. Now I'm rounding out those corners from where I cut the V's out of the individual petals. This will just, again, make them a little bit more realistic looking. Now I'm making the centerpieces of design for each one of the flowers using a flower cutout punch tool. And again, I'm going to use my rolling pin and I'm going to flatten these out so they don't look so uniform, and that way they look a little more realistic. Now I'm moving on to making some leaves, and so I'm using a heart tool. And then with that, after I have each of them cut out, I'm going to go back and I'm going to cut out some designs into the sides of the hearts to make these leaves. And again, you see I'm making these in all different colors. Here I am making the centerpieces for each one of those flowers. And as I mentioned, I'm cutting out those sides for each one of those hearts to make the leaves. And now that the leaves are done, I'm making a brown backing for my stitch just to make him a bit more sturdy. So I'm cutting him out. And I'm going to use some piping gel and attach him to this piece of brown fondant. Here I am preparing to attach him. I'm using some water here. And there we go, we're attaching him to that. And there he is. That's him without the arms. And these are the rest of the pieces that I have just made. Of course, they're not yet cleaned up from the powdered sugar. Now I'm going to move forward and begin assembling my cake. So I'm putting some icing onto the cake board, and I'm going to begin to stack the cake. There I am straightening up the cake a bit, and now I'm covering this with my crumb coat. You can hear a train in the background of my video. So now that I have a very general base of icing, I'm going to finish crumb coating this cake. And I'm going to begin now to put my top coat of colored icing. So you'll see that I'm putting 3 layers of different colors, but ultimately I am going to be blending these colors. You won't see me do that in the video. I didn't really get a chance to film that part of the video, but I apologize about that. So I'm smoothing out this icing. And after I had it smooth, then I went back and marbled it, and this is what that looked like. And now I'm beginning to put the components onto the cake. So here I am going to add some sand, which is some crushed up graham crackers, brown sugar, and white sugar. And I'm just adding that to the cake board for some sand. And I'm going to add that first topper with the name on it. And I'm going to add the number. I will say that I don't like the final placement of this. I wish I would have done this top different. But when I tried to move it, it did not lift well, so I had to let it where it was. And now I'm just kind of adding all the different pieces that I made. So you'll see me kind of moving stuff around and placing things. Adding that centerpiece for the flower. And I'm bending those flowers kind of forward into more of a flower shape instead of them remaining flat. And of course, last but not least, I'm adding my stitch, the star of the show. And there's our cake. This is what it looked like at the end. If you enjoyed this video, please, I encourage you to like, comment, share, and I would love if you would subscribe to my channel. And last not least, if you would, I would love if you would come back and join me for future content. Thank you again for joining me.